I still remember the exact moment my sister leaned back in her chair, smirked at me across the dinner table, and loudly asked if anyone wanted to chip in so I could. Offered dessert for once. And the whole room went silent before exploding into awkward laughter. That was the night I realized my own family saw me as nothing more than the poor, broken sibling, the cautionary tale, the one you mock so you can feel better about yourself. What they didn't know was that I was carrying a secret so big it was burning a hole in my chest, and I had seconds to decide whether to stay silent like I always did or finally show them who I really was. So tell me honestly, if your own sister humiliated you in front of everyone you loved, would you keep the peace, or would you burn the whole illusion down right there at the table? Before I get to what I did next, you need to understand how we got there, because this wasn't just one cruel joke. This was a lifetime of being compared, dismissed, and quietly broken down piece by piece. I grew up as the older sibling, but somehow my younger sister, Emma, became what everyone called the golden child. From the time she could walk, she was praised for everything. If she got a B, it was because the teacher was too hard. If I got a B, it was because I wasn't applying myself. She was beautiful, charismatic, effortlessly social. I was the awkward one who liked books, kept to myself, and didn't know how to charm a room. Our parents never said they loved her more, but they never had to. It was in the way their faces lit up when she walked in, and the way their shoulders slumped when it was just me. Growing up, Emma always had the best clothes, the newest phone, the biggest birthday parties. When money was tight, somehow my extras were the first to go. You understand, right? My mom would say, already moving on. Emma understood too, but in a different way. She understood that she came first. By high school, she was student council president, cheer captain, and dating the star quarterback. I was working a part-time job after school, saving for college, and being told I should be grateful for the opportunity to learn responsibility. When Emma decided she wanted to go to an expensive, private university, my parents took out loans without blinking. When I said I wanted to apply to a decent state school, my dad sighed and asked if I'd considered community college instead. I don't tell you this for pity. I tell you this because it shaped everything that came after. I learned early that if I wanted anything, I had to earn it myself. I moved out as soon as I could, working 2 jobs while studying, living in tiny apartments with roommates who stole my food. Emma, meanwhile, floated from success to success, always with a safety net. When she graduated, my parents threw her a massive party. When I graduated, they sent a card and said they were so proud. But they couldn't make it because they were busy helping Emma move into her new place. Life didn't exactly go easy on me after that. The industry I went into was unstable, and I bounced between jobs. I had a long-term relationship fall apart, partly because I was always stressed about money. There were months I lived paycheck to paycheck, months I had to choose between rent and groceries. My family knew I was struggling, but it was always framed as my fault. If you'd made better choices, my mom would say. Emma, on the other hand, married well. Her husband came from money, and together they built a life that looked perfect on social media. Big house, vacations, fancy dinners. Every family gathering became a subtle showcase of her success and my failure. Still, I showed up. I smiled. I laughed at jokes that hurt. I told myself it wasn't worth fighting over. I told myself that being the bigger person meant swallowing my pride. And for a long time, that's what I did. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that behind the scenes, my life had quietly started to change. Years of grinding, of taking risks no one supported, had finally begun to pay off. I'd started a small side project that grew into something real. It wasn't flashy, and I didn't talk about it because I was terrified of jinxing it. I'd learned that whenever I shared good news, it somehow got minimized or turned into a competition with Emma. So I kept it to myself, letting them believe I was still barely scraping by. That brings us to the dinner. It was a family gathering at my parents' house, one of those obligatory events where everyone pretends everything is fine. Emma and her husband arrived late, of course, making an entrance. She wore something designer, casually mentioning how she'd almost forgotten the dinner because they just returned from a weekend getaway. My parents fawned over her, asking questions, pouring drinks. When I arrived, carrying a simple bottle of wine, my mom thanked me distractedly and asked if I was still doing okay. I said yes, because what else was I supposed to say? Dinner started out normal enough. Small talk, forced laughter, the usual. Emma dominated the conversation, telling stories about her life, her plans, her successes. Every now and then, she'd glance at me with that familiar look, the one that said she knew exactly where she stood compared to me. Then, as dessert was being served, the conversation turned to finances. My dad made a comment about how expensive everything was getting. Emma laughed and said something about how some people just don't know how to manage money. I felt my stomach drop. I knew where this was going. She looked directly at me and said, "No offense, but not everyone can just afford dessert, right?" There was a pause, and then she added, louder, "I mean, I know you've had it rough, still renting, still figuring things out. It must be hard being so broken financially." She smiled like she'd said something playful. The table went quiet. My parents didn't say anything. A few relatives chuckled uncomfortably. I felt my face burn. Years of resentment, of feeling invisible, of being the family disappointment, all crashed into me at once. In that moment, I had a choice. I could laugh it off, like I always did, make a joke at my own expense, and let the night move on. Or, I could finally stop pretending. I could finally show them that the story they'd been telling themselves about me was wrong. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely hear anything else. My hands were shaking under the table. I thought about all the times I'd been overlooked, all the sacrifices I'd made, all the nights I'd cried alone because I felt like I'd never be enough. And that's where I'm going to pause this part of the story, because what I did next changed everything. In the next part, I'll tell you what I said, what I showed them, and how the entire dinner table turned on its head in a way I never imagined. But before that, I want you to really sit with this moment. Imagine being humiliated by your own sister, labeled poor and broken in front of your family. Would you have stayed quiet, or would you have finally stood up for yourself, no matter the consequences? Because in the next part, you'll see exactly which choice I made, and whether it set me free or cost me. I took a slow breath, the kind you take when you're standing on the edge of something, and you know there's no going back once you step forward. And I realized that if I stayed silent one more time, I would hate myself forever. The room was still quiet, everyone waiting for me to laugh it off, to play my usual role. My sister was still smiling, confident, relaxed, completely sure she'd won this little moment. And that's when I felt something inside me finally snap, not in a loud, explosive way, but in a calm, terrifyingly clear way, like a decision had been made without my permission. I looked up at her and said, very evenly, "You know what's funny, Emma? You all think you know exactly how my life looks." The smile on her face flickered, just a little, like a light bulb losing power. At first, everyone thought I was joking. My dad even chuckled and said my name like a warning, the way he always did when he wanted me to stop talking. But I didn't stop. Years of swallowing my words had built pressure, and once it started coming out, there was no way to shove it back in. I told them how tired I was of being treated like the family failure, the charity case, the punchline. I told them how every joke about money, every sigh about my choices, had stacked up over time. Emma tried to interrupt me, saying I was being dramatic, that she was just kidding. But I kept going. My voice was shaking, but it was loud enough that everyone heard me. Then I did the thing I'd sworn I would never do. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone, not to show pictures or texts, but to open an app I'd spent years staring at in secret. I turned the screen toward them and said, "I didn't want to talk about this until it was final, because every time I've shared something good, it somehow turned into a competition or got dismissed. But since we're already talking about who's poor and broken, I paused, letting the silence stretch. You should probably know that the side project I've been working on just sold. My mom frowned, confused. My dad leaned forward. Emma rolled her eyes, clearly unimpressed. I told them the number, not dramatically, not shouting, just calmly stating it. The room didn't explode with reactions the way you see in movies. Instead, it went dead silent, like the air had been sucked out. My dad's fork slipped from his hand and clinked against the plate. My mom's mouth actually fell open. Emma laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound, and said, "That's not funny. Why would you lie about something like that?" That hurt more than anything else she'd said all night, because it showed how little faith she had in me, how impossible it was for her to imagine me succeeding. So I showed them. I showed them the email confirmation, the contract summary, the account balance that reflected years of work finally paying off. I didn't do it to brag. I did it because I was tired of being invisible. I was tired of letting them define me. As the reality sank in, the atmosphere shifted. My dad started asking questions, rapid fire, trying to understand. My mom reached out and touched my arm, her eyes glossy, saying she had no idea. Emma just stared at the phone, her face pale, like the ground had disappeared beneath her. And here's the thing no one tells you about moments like that. They don't feel triumphant the way you imagine. There was no rush of victory, no instant satisfaction. What I felt was exhaustion. Deep, bone, tired exhaustion. Because even in that moment, I realized this wasn't just about money. It was about years of being seen as less than, years of not being believed. Emma finally spoke, and her voice was tight. She said, "So what? You're rich now. You think that makes you better than me." The irony almost made me laugh. I told her no, it didn't make me better than anyone. It just meant that the story she'd been telling herself about me was wrong. That's when things really unraveled. My parents started apologizing, overlapping each other, saying they should have paid more attention, that they hadn't realized how hard things had been for me. Part of me wanted to scream that it shouldn't have taken a bank balance for them to care. Emma got defensive, accusing me of hiding things, of trying to make her look bad. I told her I'd hidden it because I didn't feel safe sharing my life with people who only valued success when it came wrapped in her name. That hit a nerve. She stood up, knocking her chair back, and said she couldn't believe I'd do this to her at a family dinner. So that was the situation I was in. The truth was out. The roles we'd all been playing for decades were cracking. Before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you how far this went and what it cost me, I want you to pause for a second and really think about it. If you were me, standing there with everyone suddenly seeing you differently, would you have tried to smooth things over? Would you have apologized for making things uncomfortable, even though you'd done nothing wrong? Or would you have stood your ground and let the discomfort sit where it belonged? Go ahead and comment what you would have done, because the choice I made changed my relationship with my family forever. I didn't apologize. For the first time in my life, I didn't rush to fix everyone else's feelings. I told them calmly that I hadn't intended to make a scene, but I wasn't going to accept being mocked anymore. I said that if we were going to be a family, it had to be based on respect, not comparisons. Emma scoffed and said I was overreacting, that she'd always been supportive. That was when years of memories flooded back, every backhanded compliment, every, "least you're trying," every public joke about my finances. I asked her, quietly, to name one time she defended me when someone put me down. She couldn't. The argument spiraled after that. My parents tried to mediate, but it was clear they were seeing things through a new lens. And Emma hated that. She accused them of choosing sides, of suddenly treating me like the favorite. I watched my golden child sister experience, for the first time, what it felt like not to be the center of unquestioned praise. And it was ugly. She cried. She yelled. She said I was tearing the family apart. I wanted to tell her the family had been cracked long before this dinner, that I'd just finally stopped pretending. I left early that night. I didn't storm out, but I didn't linger either. As I drove home, My hands were still shaking, my chest tight. I kept replaying everything in my head, wondering if I'd gone too far, if I'd just confirmed every negative thing they'd ever thought about me. When I got home, I sat on my couch in the dark and cried, not because I regretted speaking up, but because it hurt so much to realize how conditional their support had been. The next few days were tense. My mom called constantly, apologizing, asking to meet. My dad sent long texts saying he was proud of me. Emma didn't reach out at all. When we finally sat down again, just my parents and me, it was awkward. They admitted they'd leaned on the narrative of me being the struggling one, because it was easier than confronting their own favoritism. Hearing that hurt, but it was also validating in a way I didn't expect. Emma eventually sent a message, not an apology, but a defensive explanation about how she'd always felt pressure to be perfect and how my success made her feel threatened. I realized then that her cruelty had always come from insecurity, even if she'd never admit it. Our relationship hasn't magically healed. We're distant now, polite but guarded. And you know what? That's okay. Because the biggest change wasn't in how they saw me, but in how I saw myself. I stopped bending myself into shapes that made other people comfortable. I stopped measuring my worth against my sister's approval. Success didn't fix everything, but standing up for myself did something even more important. It gave me peace. So that's how it ended. Not with applause, not with a perfect reconciliation, but with truth finally out in the open. If you've ever been the broken one in your family, the one everyone underestimates, I want you to know this: you don't owe anyone silence. You don't owe anyone your smallness. And sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do isn't to prove them wrong with numbers or titles, but to refuse to accept their version of you. If you were on my side in this story, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe if you want to hear more real, messy stories like this one. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments, because I read every single one. I'll see you all in the next story.